Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Samuel Veissière. He's a clinician-researcher at RAPS, that is the Réseaux, Recherche et Action sur les Polarisations Sociales, formerly assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at McGill University. He is an anthropologist and psychosocial clinician working at the intersection of psychiatry, cognitive science, and the social sciences. And today we're focusing on topics like internet and sociality, smartphone addiction, culture and mental health, placebos, and the free energy approach to human cognition and culture. So, Dr. Veissière, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So, I would like to start with your work on the internet and its impact on cognition, well-being, social relations, and so on. So, could you start by telling us a little bit about what you studied there exactly in terms of the psychosocial impact that the internet has?
Yeah, well, at first I was very interested in what happens to humanity once we transition into this digital niche. It seemed to me there was a broad set of unexamined questions, and I've changed my mind many times over the years. I do want to say at this point, having researched this phenomenon for many years, I think the internet is an absolute disaster. I think that human sociality, once it's happening on the internet, exponentializes by far the very worst, the most vile, dangerous, violent aspects of human nature. But before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit about what I've learned, or at least some questions that I've asked when studying the internet. The first thing I found fascinating is that for me, studying human sociality on the internet taught me a lot about how sociality and how the human mind works to begin with. Namely, that the human mind is this wonderful, evolved organism that is in many ways works just like the internet, in that it's optimized to outsource or download fitness-relevant information and sometimes entire cultural packages to a network of other minds, and to a network as well of cumulative cultural knowledge that no single human could ever have invented or devised sort of on her own. I've come to realize over the years that when faced with an overabundance of information, a lot of interesting and worrying things happen. I mean, at first we might have wondered, we might have thought that having access to potentially the entire memory of humankind, just, at the touch of a thumb scroll would be a wonderful thing, but it doesn't seem to be what happened. So let me backtrack a little bit and tell you a bit more about sociality and the human mind and how they work on the internet. So sociality, speaking, refers to the capacity to form joint goals, to engage in shared attentions, and to engage in joint action. So this is not unique to humans. There are many social species, but humans have an added sociocultural, symbolic, and also narrative dimension that I mentioned briefly. So when faced with an overabundance of information, we've learned that the human mind tends to create these bottlenecks for evolutionarily cheap or evolutionarily salient information. So things that are particularly relevant for our fitness, things that the human mind craves much more than Big Macs, and in fact, much more than sex. Pardon me, I'm going to turn this off. So here we're talking about things like threat, negativity, pornography, tribalism, mass herding, social contagion, and sort of mass hysteria. So unfortunately, we've learned that this is sort of what happens to the average human once they're precipitated into this kind of weirdly disembodied digital niche. And the internet, in many ways, has made us much more paranoid. It's made us much more negative. I mean, remember that the human mind is kind of like an overactive smoke detector. We need to be very attentive to things that pose a potential threat. We know the fabled stories that we evolved in conditions that were very different from the ones in which we live now, a very volatile environment. So we know that we tend to be much, much more negative on the internet. We know that news with negative content about danger, about social threats in particular, about tribal affiliations tend to generate more clicks, more shares, more time watching, etc. So to again, make a long story short, I would say that the total impact of the internet on humanity is probably a net negative. This is not to say that it has not brought benefits. I sometimes think of it sort of like a tail end phenomenon, kind of like the distribution curve for IQ. There's probably in the far right end a small number of people that has greatly benefited from having access to so much knowledge. At the same time, I want to say with a huge social cost, there is a social cost to just kind of spending time online. But my fear is that the internet, and I know it's hyperbolic, but may bring us to some kind of doom. And we're seeing it right now with the immense social polarization and radicalization that is happening, the difficulty that people have talking to each other, the way in which people have become much more on edge, much more unnuanced. So yeah, I would say in a nutshell, this is what I can tell you about the internet from an evolutionary perspective.
But could you explain a little bit better how you studied the internet and its impacts on human sociality and psychology? I mean, I'm asking you that also because I've had several different people on the show, and of course, this is a very broad question, and we would have to perhaps break it down into several different domains because the internet is a very broad thing that includes many things like social media, pornography, video games, and so on and so forth. And I've had people on the show, many of them have been somewhat or even very critical of the literature about the supposed psychological impacts of some of those things, of course, like, for example, if it has really produced more political polarization, the supposed psychological impacts of consuming pornography, the psychological impacts of social media, and so on. So, I mean, before we get into perhaps some of those criticisms, tell us a little bit more about how you approach this, how you studied it.
Yeah, so perhaps the internet tends to exponentialize and exacerbate a lot of aspects of human nature and a lot of our most basic needs, most of which are social in different ways, and most of which are related to social fitness in different ways. So certainly the literature on the impact of the internet on mental health, for example, is at this point inconclusive, and it is controversial. Some studies, for example, claim to find a causal effect between, say, time spent online or time spent on social media and poor mental health, and others don't. It may be that there's a confound because there's different kinds of construct and measures. So not all studies are looking at the same thing. We know, as a matter of association and correlation, that Generation Z, sometimes called iGen, so I'm thinking of the works of Jean Twenge and her more current work with Jonathan Haidt, for example. So the generation born after 1994, the generation primarily socialized online, generation that had much less face-to-face contact, appears to be much more polarized, and it for sure suffers from much more frequent mental health problems, especially depression, anxiety, personality disorders, self-harm, body identity disorders of all kinds. So it is correct that the causal link has not been clearly established. For many of us, it sort of flies in the face. It's kind of obvious. So you mentioned different dimension. You mentioned social media. You mentioned pornography. Well, social media tends to fulfill the very basic narcissistic human need. And I use the term narcissism in the more psychodynamic, psychoanalytic sense, not as a pathology, but as a need to be seen, as a need to be validated. This is completely normal. So on the one hand, our very individualistic societies have these strange injunctions saying that, you know, you should just be who you are and not care what other people think. But of course, we care most deeply about being seen, about being validated. it's much more stressful once we're projected into this bottomless, agora of again, just the weight of the gaze on young bodies is extraordinarily stressful. So you take all the kinds of the micro drama of everyday life, of socialization, of wanting to be popular, for example. Well, that's a lot more stressful on the internet. Being intimidated, being ignored, for example, that's much more popular, but it's much more stressful on the internet. So things like social credit scores have always existed on an implicit level. Humans are always scanning the social world for models of whom they should emulate, who their allies are, who their enemies are. And we do it much more. We do it faster. We do it much more potently on the internet. So there's this again, kind of exponentialization. The impact of pornography is also quite controversial, although several researchers and journalists have noticed what has sometimes been called a sex recession. It appears as though Generation Z also has less sex than previous generations. They have less long-lasting relationships. They're also, and I think we'll get there later, they've considerably shuffled and reinvented what it means to be gendered, what it means to be human, what it means to be sexual. The overall result appearing to be some kind of confusion. When it comes to pornography, it could be that young men in particular form very unrealistic expectations of what relationships are like, and that's not being matched in what the real world sort of gives them. But my own concern as a researcher and a clinician is on two dimensions. One being political polarization. There's this mass herding, this kind of tribalism, the extreme difficulty that younger people in particular, appear to have talking across ideological divides or different value systems. And also on mental health. In a moment, we'll probably talk a bit about addiction as well, but I can tell you something that child and adolescent psychiatrists see the world over is young children who are sent, younger and younger children who are sent to the emergency room because when their parents try to take away their tablets, they have an absolute meltdown. There's also things like the spread of different kinds of potentially factitious mental health disorders. Self-harm has shown to be very contagious on social media. I could go on and on with just horrific examples of what happens to people, and young people in particular, once they're socialized online in this disembodied space.
Okay, so as I said, several different things that we could get into here. You mentioned, for example, there at the end, self-harm, and I would imagine you would be talking about some of those, for example, challenges that sometimes we see on the news that spread across, for example, TikTok, YouTube, and other kinds of social media. But I mean, when it comes to that specifically, the kind of way we tend to talk about it, isn't it a little bit overblown? I mean, isn't it the case that the number of actual victims of those kinds of things is very little, or am I wrong?
Yeah, so I would say if we're talking about the fear that young people will be groomed or recruited by a network of sadistic individuals, I mean, that's thankfully quite rare, and that's overblown. The kinds of challenges that are not so much viral on TikTok, but that are viral in stories about those alleged challenges, I would say those are greatly overblown. I'm concerned with a much more initially mundane and normal, again, narcissistic human need to be seen. Something that interests me greatly about the human species is that, I tend to think of it as a kind of a fragility trade-off. So about 2 million years ago or so in the Homo erectus lineage, we developed cooperative breeding, collective child rearing. We started caring for the weak, caring for the sick. This was really the strength of our species. So we traded off individualism and physical strength for this kind of vulnerability. And from there evolved two key human competencies: the ability to understand other people's needs and the ability to signal our suffering so as to receive help. I sometimes think there might be something of the risk of if not fully a spandrel, a kind of a maladaptive risk, in that it's often quite advantageous socially to suffer. If you think of sibling rivalry, for example, often siblings are competing for the weakest status so as to receive parental care and parental attention. Yeah. So we've also seen a lot of this, so-called culture of victimhood of culture of suffering, online, particularly for Generation Z. This is again not new, and we know that comparing the cross-cultural and historical record, some cultures, some religions have elevated suffering as an end in itself more than others. So again, it seems to me there's a sort of universal human risk. So going back to what we see in the clinical context, we see a lot of young people who, who go through the difficulties of growing up, and who want to find networks of peers, who want social support, and who share stories about how they're unwell. And it's on that level that we have seen perhaps not full-fledged epidemic, but a tendency to exacerbate and to copy behaviors like cutting, for example, or emphasizing, I was going to say the desire to have a mental health condition. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of sharing and these organic modes of sociality among young people that are articulated among suffering, sometimes relating in harm. And there are really terrible stories that I'm hesitant to talk about online, because I don't want to create more sort of contagion. But young people can go very far in seeking attention and in seeking this sort of validation, and in incrementally, but at some point exponentially raising the bar of the kinds of distress that they will display online so as to receive care, attention, validation, etc.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get into addiction in a second, but just before that, going back for a second to what I mentioned earlier, particularly related to mental health, and you mentioned there, for example, the work by Jean Twenge, Jonathan Haidt, and others trying to link the use of social media to certain mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and so on in Gen Z and so on. I mean, since, and you mentioned that there, since that sort of link is very disputed, is that something that you draw from? Is that something that worries you a lot? Because I mean, again, looking at the studies and literature reviews, meta-analysis, and so on, the results seem to be always the same. It is either inconclusive, or the results come up the other way. That is, that the internet, instead of having negative psychological effects, actually has positive psychological effects. If the results come negative, usually the effects tend to seem very tiny. So, I mean, is that something that at least at this point we should care a lot about, since basically the evidence is, I guess, inconclusive, right?
Yeah, I think we ought to care about that, and we ought to conduct more meticulous and more ecologically valid studies. I would like to hope that if we had a large epidemiological surveys with a battery of very kind of broad psychosocial functioning tests, the kinds of tests that the PISA framework for well-being in schools that the OECD uses, it seems to me that we would have much richer data, and we might be able to establish perhaps more causal effects. I remain a fan, and I hope it's not an ideological bias of mine. I want to say, if the data shows me otherwise, I will change my mind. As a parenthesis, I also agree with the claim that in some cases, so that doesn't mean just for some humans, but it means in some aspects of our lives, the internet has positive psychological effects. It is a source of socialization. It is a source of meaning. It is a source of pleasure. There's no question. But I was going to say I'm a fan of the kinds of hypotheses put forth by, again, Jonathan Haidt and Twenge via their parallel interest in helicopter parenting. So from that perspective, which is also an evolutionary or an evo-devo evolutionary developmental perspective, a young organism needs to sample a broad enough range of statistical regularities in the world, including a broad enough range of potential threats, so as to learn to optimize its system, so as to learn to navigate the complexity and the unpredictability of the world around them. I think that once people are deprived of that, once they're in their bedroom, once they're behind a screen most of the time, there's a very strange kind of mismatch and gap that happens where they can be very theoretically and intellectually knowledgeable about a whole range of things they're not able to apply in real life. So this may also be one, this may also explain why once people who are primarily socialized online leave the bedroom and enter even, a relatively safe space like a university classroom, they get constantly triggered because the world is sending them information that does not match their expectations. And this creates, what in psychology we call anxiety or stress. So that may also be a kind of a secondary effect of the internet. Not so much the internet itself causes these mental health difficulties, but the fact that people just move and grow up in very different ways. And there's so many quote unquote normal things that they're not experiencing anymore.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into addiction now, because you've done some work specifically on smartphone addiction. So first of all, how do you understand addiction in this context? What does it mean exactly? How does it manifest?
Yeah, so I have a very pragmatic, completely amoral, non-judgmental perspective on addiction. Addiction is anything that you do is too much, anything that will interfere with your everyday life and cause impaired functioning in everyday life. So the studies on smartphone addiction that we've conducted use a scale called problematic smartphone use that looks at the impact of phones in a variety of aspects of everyday life, from sleep and neck pain to what interests me the most, sort of social relations. So for example, you may really love being on your smartphone, but if other people tell you, frequently comment that you spend too much time on your phone, if you missed opportunities, if you have conflicts at home or at work, then we may say that there's a problem.
Mm-hmm. But do we know if that's a widespread issue? I mean, are there many people, particularly, I guess, in this case, younger people suffering from smartphone addiction?
Yeah, we've conducted several studies, including international surveys and meta-analyses of existing studies. The first effect that we found years ago when we were just trying to find different kinds of psychological correlates of smartphone addiction, that was an early kind of funky study that we did trying to see if smartphone addiction correlated with hypnotizability. So we hypnotized something like 600 university students in Montreal. We found a weak correlation, but we also found that the rates of smartphone addictions among young university students were very, very high. This is something that we found in subsequent studies, surveying, and our latest one has, I believe, something like 95 countries, and it's almost always the same effect. So younger people are much more addicted. This is also based on screen time measures, so they spend much more time on their phone, but also females are much more addicted. So then there are some country level differences that are very interesting. We see that on average, East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, people are more addicted than in Europe. North America is somewhere in the middle. And we also find that countries with high cultural tightness, so tightness, looseness is a kind of a cultural measure that describes the extent to which people abide by strict social norms or not. So people in culturally tight countries appear to spend more time on their phone and be more prone to smartphone addiction.
And since we're focusing mostly on sociality here, what are some of the effects that smartphone addiction has on sociality specifically?
Well, as I said earlier, I think it exacerbates and exponentializes some of the riskiest aspects of sociality, in particular, the groupism, the tribalism, and the kind of herding. And this is a very old question, as you know, in evolutionary anthropology. I mean, going back to even Dunbar's number and the average number of people that the average cognitive mind can kind of handle. But we know from various sources of evidence in various disciplines that humans are through and through very, very tribal. We have this intrinsic need to identify our allies, but also to identify our enemies. So it's interesting to see that sociality on the internet has, of course, on some level, extended the range and the scope, certainly the geography of solidarity, but it has created much more social competition, and it has created much more social divides. And we've seen, again, I want to say, with the conceptual tools that are available to us at this point, we have not established a clear causal link, but we know that since the advent of the internet, we appear to have become much more politically polarized, more so in some countries than others. It could be that, say, the kind of polarization that started peaking in North America around 2016 with the Trump election appears to have become contagious as well. So people have started polarizing in Europe and in the rest of the world around similar kind of cultural lines, arguing about similar kinds of sacred values. And I want to emphasize again those mechanisms of social contagion that I alluded to earlier when I talked about the spread of harm and the spread of illness, copying kinds of phenomena. So I would say that overall, in my view, based on what I've seen so far, polarization has increased, and probably mental illness has increased as a result of internet sociality.
So I would like to get now a little bit more into mental health specifically, and this question is something that I've already done some interviews on, particularly off the record. You mentioned, for example, Dr. Lawrence Kiermaier, who I had on the show, and we did an entire interview on this. But what role does culture play in mental health?
I would say it plays an enormous part, and to appreciate that, we can try to conceptually break down different relevant dimensions of culture, or that part of humanity that is sociocultural. I like to use a simple biological definition of culture. We know that culture exists when we notice behavioral differences which, to the best of our knowledge, arise through social learning, sociocultural learning, as opposed to simply genetics. So whatever is not kind of innate. So the impact of that aspect of humanity on mental health, well, if we start with the obvious dimensions of sociality, things like social support, things like relational mobility, which is the freedom that people have in different societies to interact with different people, cultural tightness or looseness, which I also mentioned, also things like social status, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but also other constructs like cultural consonance. Cultural consonance is the extent to which people feel that they live up to culturally postulated goals. So whatever things are elevated as good and true and important in a culture in different domains. So what is a good family? What is a good career? What is a good romantic life like? People tend to live up, measure themselves against these kinds of models. So all these different constructs that I mentioned are known empirically, causally, to have an effect not just on mental health, but on health. Social status in particular, which, as it happens, is quite difficult to define in both social science and in public health. It's not just income. It's not just cultural capital, so the sort of linguistic and symbolic resources you have available. It has something to do with the way your person and your group is positively or negatively regarded, the kind of dignity that is culturally assigned to your group in a broader social ensemble. This has a huge effect on health and on mental health as well. So we know that loss of status, loss of dignity can cause cardiovascular problems. It can cause it can trigger chronic illnesses. It can even trigger other kinds of illnesses. So those are the more kind of obvious dimensions of the sociocultural part of the human species that have a link to mental health. One that I'm particularly interested in as an anthropologist, which I suspect you might have discussed a bit with Professor Kamayer, is also the narrative and the symbolic dimension, in particular what anthropologists call idioms of distress. So idioms of distress are culturally postulated ways to make sense of suffering, to explain the cause of suffering, but also to recommend particular avenues for cure. So an idiom of distress is really a kind of a full cultural package that contains an explanation for a particular ailment, but also that contains expectations for the phenomenological presentation of how one is supposed to feel once one is recruited into this narrative model, and then particular cultural scripts for, how to get better. So what's interesting about idioms of distress is that they can be partly or wholly or not at all grounded in a scientific, quote unquote, real comprehension of a phenomenon. So in some cultures, mental illness or indeed illness itself can be explained by, the doings of ancestors or spirits. In our culture, we often invoke things like hormones and neurotransmitters. I'll note here as an anthropologist that the level at which the average human mind comprehends what's going on in their body, how they're supposed to feel, is the same. So from ancestors and spirits to, say, serotonin or testosterone, here we're invoking metaphysical ideas, which very strangely, and we'll talk about placebo in a moment, have a kind of phenomenological correlate. So again, in some cultures, someone might start feeling dizzy and they might think, okay, this is a wind attack or this is a spirit attack and I should go get a holy water treatment, say. In other cultures, people will feel a little bit of a pain in the left side of their arm and they'll believe, okay, I'm having a heart attack and I should call 911 and I should go to the hospital. But both examples describe a human being mostly implicitly and then automatically tapping into a kind of idiom of distress. So I've become very interested in how these idioms of distress, which basically encode a particular valence and phenomenological presentation in experience, can also be, I almost want to say causally, can affect human health and human well-being. So I've also been very interested in, probably since 2017 or so, in what I call the culture of mental health or mental health culture. It's very interesting how, 50, 30, maybe even 20, 15 years ago, by some accounts, we didn't talk about mental health enough. There was a stigma about it. People suffered in silence. But now it seems to me we talk about mental health all the time. So people now, in many ways, appear to understand the tribulations of the ups and downs of everyday life through a very interesting psychopathological lens, which through what you could call a nocebo, negative placebo effect, could also, in a sense, contribute to making people unwell.
Which is very interesting. You mentioned that there the culture of mental health, and I thought many times that you hear all the time people claiming that we don't talk about mental health enough or about perhaps particular conditions enough, but actually we're hearing about it all the time nowadays. At least I'm hearing about it all the time. So.
Yeah, it's very strange. I wonder, it may be a reflection of something that ought to be an anthropological law. This is a so-called, Patrick Moynihan's law, the American senator who said, the better things get, the worse they seem. There appears to be a kind of anthropological mechanism there that ought to be investigated more.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned nocebos there, for example. So from an anthropological perspective, that's where you come from, and also adding to it a clinical perspective, how do you approach placebos? What is a placebo exactly?
Well, a better term for placebo, and the one used in the literature, is non-specific effect or non-specific effects. So basically, any aspect of a cure which can be extended to any modulation of unconscious bodily resources that cannot be attributed to the intended mechanism of action. So, for example, you devise a particular pill, you have a theory that a particular molecule may cause something in the body. That thing in the body does happen, but it's not caused by that molecule. It's caused by other things. So placebo effects are very complex and multifaceted this way. I know in popular culture, we tend to think of them as say, a sugar pill, like the ones that are used in many randomized controlled trial. But again, a placebo is any modulation via an external cue of unconscious bodily resources, resulting, in most cases, this is what we want in a healing response, but it could also be resulting in an illness response. In anthropological terms, I like to think of placebos as a broad ecology of cues, of symbols, of rituals, of paraphernalia, but also of specific encounters and of different psychological and psychosocial dimensions that contribute to the cure. And here I'm nodding to the works of Irving Kirch from the placebo program at Harvard. So, I mean, I could list a few of those. We know, for example, very interestingly, that the more elaborate a placebo device or placebo ecology, usually the more effective the response. So, for example, taking 4 pills 4 times a day, placebo pills works better than 1 pill. Swallowing a big gel cap that is difficult to swallow tends to work better than just a simple sugar pill. Placebo injections work even better. And then the absolute El Dorado here, something really invasive like a placebo surgery, will work even better. So it seems there's also a motivational dimension to this. The more costly, the more people have to personally sacrifice, to personally invest in the cure, the better it works. We know that the particular dynamics and the affective dynamics of the clinical encounter, which as an anthropologist, I like to think of as a shamanic encounter, are very, very important. So in all cultures, there are individuals who undergo long initiations and eventually come to become masters of a very esoteric language. Going back to idioms of distress, it's most often a language about invisible particles that regulate the cosmos. So things like spirits, ancestors, but also neurotransmitters and hormones. These are people who usually wear very specific kinds of costumes. These are people that you encounter in very difficult to access places. So it could be like a cave atop like this mythical cold mountain, or it could be an appointment at a neurological hospital after a 6 months waiting list, knowing that the person is an expert. So this idea of epistemic expertise, the epistemic authority, someone who is a recipient and expert in this very esoteric knowledge is very important. The status, again, the epistemic status assigned to the healer or to the shaman, but also the warmth, the hope that is conveyed, the verbal suggestions that are delivered during a particular clinical encounter are very important. So when a patient is led to believe that he or she will get better, and particularly once all the cues are in place, so recall the motivation, the difficulty to access, the trust in expertise, the paraphernalia, the costumes. So we know that things like, at least in the West, white blouses and stethoscopes, when someone looks like a doctor, these things tend to work very, very well. So I could go on, but I think I've outlined, a few of the symbolic, ritual and interactive dimensions of these placebo effects.
And there's also this notion of a super placebo. What is it?
So a super placebo is something that a few researchers and I and others in other labs have tried to toy around with, which is trying to stack up and experimentally manipulate as many of the ritual, symbolic, and psychosocial and technological dimensions of placebos so as to create a super placebo procedure, one in which the placebo response is so strong that it may lead to very spectacular kinds of healing.
And so, I mean, how do you look at placebos from a therapeutic perspective? Because I guess that we could say they are doing something, right? I mean, because sometimes I'm saying this because many times people tend to dismiss certain effects. So it's just a placebo effect, but it's still an effect, right?
Yeah, to me, the notion that something is just a placebo effect is ludicrous. However, the question of placebo therapeutics raises all kinds of very complex, first epistemic and then ethical questions. So again, remember that a placebo is just whatever way to bypass or short circuit conscious mechanisms so as to tap into parts of, say, bodily responses that are not typically consciously accessible, things like autonomic resources or healing responses. It's a complicated question because I want to say that at the time that I was working on hypnosis, which is another way to tap into these unconscious resources and placebo effects, I might have been a little bit more naive than where I am now, given that I've taken a lot of clinical training and I've been working in a clinical and a psychotherapeutic context for about 4 years now. So I'm a little bit more skeptical about this kind of, quick fixes and this idea that you can, instantly remove a problem with a quick intervention. However, there is no question that wonderful, almost miraculous things can be achieved with a placebo therapeutic. The medical profession and the medical research funding bodies, by and large, have been very reluctant to fund this kind of research, probably because it raises difficult ethical questions about the role of deception in healing, for example. Yeah. If we lie to someone, what are the possible consequences? Pragmatically, it could be, well, if they find out that it was all a sham, so to speak, are they going to stop? Are they going to get worse? Are the symptoms going to return? Is there a risk that people might lose trust in the institution of medicine, thereby actually losing access to another placebo dimension that I mentioned earlier? Because that's another point about placebo research, is that any intervention, any clinical encounter contains a placebo dimension. So our hope was that those could be harnessed, those could be used, but it very well may be, if we lay aside the worry about deception for a while, that particularly when it comes to mental health conditions, there are things that simply take a long time to work on. So when you look at the difficulties of a quote unquote mental order, a lot of the time people have built, say, defense mechanisms that help them function, that help them sustain the difficulties of life in some sense, but that also cause impairments in other aspects of their lives. I think what most psychotherapists and most mental health clinicians would tell you is that if you remove a defense too quickly, the person is often not equipped to function. So you got to go much, much slower. If we had time, we could talk about the current hype in psychedelic psychiatry, for example, which many of us think, carries that danger. It's a little bit too quick a fix. Psychedelics, by the way, this is relevant to the current conversation. To our best understanding, they are a kind of super placebo enhancer. Psychedelics greatly exponentialize and greatly augment sensitivity to contextual cues. So they make all the placebo dimensions of a clinical encounter much more potent, which is why, as a super tool, psychedelics have to be used very, very cautiously. Like the context, the ethical context has to be conceptualized very, very cautiously. So, in a nutshell, some of the difficult questions around placebo therapeutics.
And also, there's this idea of neuroplacebos that has to do with the fact with how people react to neuroimaging. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think simply neuroculture, neuroenchantment, my former mentor Amir Raz calls it, has a lot of currency in our culture. It is an explanatory model that has very, very high epistemic authority because of frequency of exposure, because of the very high epistemic status assigned to everything neuro. So it's very interesting to me as an anthropologist to see the way in which people and young people routinely invoke the idea of the brain as an agency other than the self. So we often hear 7 or 8-year-olds tell you, oh, I have ADHD, my frontal lobes won't let me concentrate. And here in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, yeah, they're invoking the ancestors or the spirits. So all this to say that we talk about neuro everything at this point. We have neuro nutrition, neuropolitics, and neuro education. Yeah, neurotechnology is very elaborate. It has this salience. It has this epistemic currency. So we know that for rhetoric, for example, if you want to make a particular argument, if you're able to have just brain imaging pictures, people will be convinced more easily. So for me, yeah, neuroplacebo is just a way to tap into this neural culture as a placebo intervention. And we've done a bit of that experimentally in the lab, and we had very surprising results. So we used, for example, building on the works of my former mentor, Amir Raz, and his graduate students who were doing different technologies. They were curious about the extent to which people can be convinced first that a machine could read their mind. So in the first installment, way back in 2014, they had a very crudely built brain machine that was not even explained in terms of its functioning, that was built from, I believe, a hairdresser's helmet. And then with the help of a magic trick, people could very easily be convinced that this brain machine could read their thoughts, could guess what number they were thinking of. In subsequent experiments, students and researchers in the Raz lab wanted to know if people's behavior could be influenced by tapping into this kind of neuroenchantment. And they also found that they were, through the use of the magic trick, able to insert thoughts into people's minds. But at the time, participants reported very interesting things, several of whom reported feeling dizziness or tingling or a very dull headache. And we began to wonder at the time if we could tap into that a little further. So we started using a much more elaborate mock scanner that was used, mock MRI scanner that was used for people with phobias to train going into the machine. And later we got to use a real, although defunct, MRI at a neurological hospital. And we piloted a study with children with neurodevelopmental disorders and behavioral difficulties, giving them specific suggestions about their symptoms, encouraging them to believe that they would get better, and we found very strong results at the time. So that's an example of a super placebo intervention. We had a waiting list. We had people coming to this difficult to get to neurological hospital. We had this very elaborate technology. We had warm pseudo clinicians delivering very positive suggestions tailored to the child's difficulties and to the child's strength, and we had very promising results at the time. I say at the time because, and here I'm going back to potential pitfalls of these placebo interventions, we're not sure about how long those typically last. You can create a very hopeful, very euphoric response once people are hooked to the novelty of an intervention, but very few studies have tracked in the long term the longitudinal positive effects of placebo interventions.
Mm-hmm. So getting to, I guess, the last part of our interview, going back to human cognition and culture, and some of the things we're going to talk about here, you've probably already mentioned or touched on when I asked you about the role that culture plays in mental health. But tell us a little bit about the free energy approach to human cognition and culture. What is this approach about? How does it work?
Yeah, so the free energy or the variational free energy approach is relatively new mathematical formulation of something that I want to say has been known for a long time in different cultures and different philosophical traditions, namely that reality is some kind of illusion or projection, or that what we see is really kind of what we expect. So the free energy principle is borrowed from physics, and it's really Professor Carl Friston at Imperial College London, a psychiatrist and neuro scientist who pioneered these approaches. And we were fortunate with Lawrence Kamayer, others, to work on with Professor Carl Friston on a free energy formulation of the coevolution of cognition and culture that we'll talk about and of culture. So the free energy principle describes the way in which organisms strive to maintain themselves in a state of self-organization by resisting entropic decay. So I'll cut the long story short here, because physicists and mathematicians sometimes are unhappy with the way in which we use the term entropy. We use the term entropy here in information theoretic terms about the amount of possibilities that are available to a specific organism in any different system. So the idea is that life as a whole attempts to resist entropy by maintaining itself, by making itself consistent. But minimizing free energy here means free energy for living things refers to the average gap or the mismatch between what an organism expects and what it gets, what external states of the world afford, if you will. So these expectations are primarily based on evolved dispositions, but then behavior will be evolved dispositions plus or minus constraints in the environment. A kind of a parallel sister approach to the free energy principle is the predictive processing paradigm in cognitive science, which I know you're knowledgeable about, which is again this idea that individual organisms scan statistical regularities in the world around them and what they get in the world, so as to predict optimized behavior to deal with particular fitness relevant solutions. What we try to do with the cultural affordances and thinking through other minds model is apply this to human cognition, first of all, and to apply this to the evolution of culture and to the cultural part of human beings. The free energy principle in predictive processing describes the behavior of individual brains quite well, but what we felt was missing was this, and I want to call it this internet dimension, this kind of this network of other minds. One of our hypotheses, which I want to say still needs to be verified empirically through different methods, is that the domains of statistical regularities in the world that are most important to humans, so as to be able to create models, internal models to function and to survive, is other minds. So this is what we call the thinking through other minds framework, for this kind of, in mathematical terms, the Markov blanket, the statistical buffer between an individual's expectations and the world around them. Humans outsource these solutions to other minds, to caregivers, to their group. But it's interesting to think of things like institutions and technologies like language, kinship, politics as anti-entropic, as entropy minimizing kinds of mechanisms. So of late, I've also become interested in political polarization, as you know, but of political polarization as a kind of entropy minimization. It's very interesting to note, for example, how whenever there's a rapid disruption in a sociocultural ecology, so this could be a pandemic, it could be a natural disaster, but very sadly for democracies, it could also be when people's, what psychotherapists called assumptive worlds. So the totality of expectations about what people hold to be true and good in the world, whenever that changes too quickly, people tend to kind of retract to a more kind of conservative position. So an influx of mass immigration, for example, will typically cause a rise in populism or a tightening of social norms or tightening of values for certain at least for certain groups who feel like they don't recognize the world around them, because it has become too entropic, because it has become too complex.
And so, but how do cognition and culture interrelate? Because if I understand it correctly, the free energy principle applies first to cognition, and then you move from cognition to culture. Is that correct?
Right. Although talking of cognition and culture for humans is almost a pleonasm, I want to say, because human cognition is, in my view, first and foremost optimized for cultural learning, so for collective learning. We know that the minimal cognitive ingredient for sociality is theory of mind, or the ability to understand others' mental states, the ability to understand others' perspective. Joint intentionality is another synonym for that. We know that a lot of our energy budget, a lot of our cognitive budget goes to social scenarios and goes to social learning. It's very interesting when you look at things like different cognitive styles, like the autistic spectrum, for example. People who are high potential and high on the autistic spectrum have these savant abilities simply as a question of energy allocation. It seems that they're spending much less on social, much less cognitive budget on social scenarios, which occupies just so much of our mental space. I say "are" for most neurotypicals, which confers them these savant-like abilities in other domains. But again, human cognition is already optimized for culture and for cultural learning.
So it's not possible to strictly separate human cognition for culture, or to talk about culture, or to talk about cognition, sorry, that is independent from culture, right?
It's difficult to know, for example, the extent to which infant cognition is already enculturated. For sure, there's a process of developmental scaffolding whereby as behavior becomes culturally patterned and reinforced, it becomes more linguistically enriched, it becomes more symbolically enriched. So it's as though over the course of ontogeny, over the course of a development, we go from relatively individual modes of cognition to increasingly more social and collective kinds of cognition. But when we look at the kinds of behavioral differences in infant behavior at the level of feeding, at the level of fussiness, at the level of attachment styles that exist, much before language acquisition, we know that cultural happening is already happening kind of under the hood, implicitly, at a very, very early age.
Okay, so let's get into two very specific aspects of human culture here that will probably be my last two questions. So how do humans learn shared expectations and norms through this framework?
This is very interesting. We don't know. We know that human learn shared expectations, and I would say that's already progress in cognitive science in terms of understanding what happens. So we have a better understanding of what happens, but we don't exactly know how it happens. If I'm to describe a little bit of what happens, well, precisely as you said, humans very early in development learn shared expectations. They learn situationally appropriate, context-appropriate responses to different environmental situations that are more and more culturally scripted, if you will. So we know that young humans are able to outsource expectations on how to behave and even how to feel on a pre-linguistic level. So with Professor Kumair, Professor Friston, Professor Maxwell Ramstad, and others, we've talked about what we call these regimes of attention. the way in which pattern cultural practice makes particular features of the world salient or not. So it's interesting to note how from one cultural ensemble to the next, people pay attention to different features of the world, and they tend to assign a particular valence to different features of the world. And then those different cues will trigger different kinds of behaviors. So we know that this happens, but we don't really know how. There is in cultural learning the same kind of poverty of stimulus problem as there is in language acquisition. So the poverty of stimulus was a problem famously posed by Noam Chomsky when he pointed out that most humans are not, in fact, no humans are taught the workings of grammar and syntax and how to string units of sound together, yet they're able to infer from relatively little explicit instruction. So when it comes to cultural learning, the same problem is observed. Young people are very, very quickly able to acquire values and to obey social norms, to obey a lot of implicit social norms. I'll give you another example from more kind of cultural psychiatry. We know that tolerance to pain is subject to wide cross-cultural differences. And there's a lot of things that happen. It could be that, a child intuitively learns a normative response inside her body by watching how her parents react. For example, is this a big deal? Is this not? Should I cry? What happens when I cry? Will I get picked up? But also, what does it mean to get picked up? Is this seen as a good thing, or is this seen as a bad thing? So we know that a person's behavior, a person's thoughts, a person's value system, but a person's phenomenology is really shaped by culture to an extraordinary extent without explicit instruction. So again, to sum up, how are these shared expectations learned? We don't know.
It's interesting that you mentioned pain there, because if I, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess that those expectations that we develop about pain and how we should react to pain and so on actually tend to have real physiological effects, right? In terms of, for example, calibrating our pain threshold and how much pain people report in several different contexts, and perhaps the level of pain that they actually phenomenologically experience, right?
For sure. Pain is still an intractable philosophical and anthropological problem. It's very difficult to measure pain. Pain at its core begins with a neurophysiological response to a particular stimulus, and then allocating attentional resources to a part of the body, let's say, that needs attention. But in order for pain to become something like suffering, so suffering to be encoded as an unwanted experience, assigned with a negative valence that feels bad. So the particular physiological event requires a cognitive interpretation, which we call for humans as a cognitive interpretation is culturally framed. So we're already recruiting and importing all kinds of implicit values and idioms of distress. But note the ways in which experiences that could be considered painful in different microcultural contexts, like, say, athletics, for example, or even, say, particular sexual practices, will be encoded with a positive valence and will phenomenologically feel good.
Or, for example, I guess also in certain religious rituals, like walking on fire, where many times, I mean, for people who don't have those kinds of practices, it might seem really weird, but many times people in those kinds of rituals, if they are asked after the fact, they don't report any pain or very little pain. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you're nodding to the work of my colleagues Dimitri Sigalatas. On fire walking and extreme rituals. Again, the neutral physiological event here is arousal, so increased heart rate and increased respiration and skin conductivity. But that doesn't tell us anything about phenomenologically what it feels like to people outside of their own cognitive interpretation, and really outside of a whole package of cultural framing that extends to particular ritual moments. It's just fascinating, again, the way in which the human physiology responds to cultural context. context.
Which is actually very interesting because the physiological response might be very similar to someone who reports pain, but it's not just the simple fact that the nociceptors get activated that the person will report experiencing pain, actually. Right.
Yes, that's correct.
So let's get into one final question, again, having to do with human culture. How does social conformity develop?
Well, I think we've already mostly answered that question in that we have failed to answer the question. We just know that it develops, and it develops slowly and then exponentially over the course of development. Adolescence is a time of particular vulnerability to social influences. In psychodynamic and psychoanalytic terms, it's also a time of kind of separation and individuation. So again, rather than tell you how it develops, I could describe the ways in which I could tell you that it develops in different and interesting ways over the course of development. And so I was, mentioning adolescence is a moment when I guess a human organism, having acquired, let's say, enough about the home and family and microenvironment, becomes very open to those meso and micro sources and starts experimenting with different kinds of identities. But I very much like the psychodynamic formulation of separation, individuation with an anthropological twist, in that becoming an individual necessarily requires social conformity. It necessarily requires becoming enculturated into another, sometimes broader sets of social convention. And I think we've already described with many examples also about how far social conformity extends, including to physiological responses, including to phenomenology, to what it feels like to be a human in a particular situation. We would like to hope that the predictive processing and free energy formulations that we've proposed help to some extent describe the mechanisms of conformity, but I want to remain humble and say that we just don't exactly know why and how that works.
Okay, so just one quick final question then. Do you think that social conformity and understanding it would tie in any way to the beginning of our discussion when we talked about the effects of the psychological effects of the internet, and you mentioned things like social contagion?
Yeah, again, the internet is underpinned by so many paradoxes, apparent and illusory paradoxes, I want to say, because the internet appears to have significantly scrambled social conformity and created an explosion of new ways of being humans and new ways of being gendered and new ways of being young. And it has, certainly increased the kind of gap between say young people and older people. That, just a very quick parallel, this sort of conservation innovation trade-off is, I think, best cashed out under a free energy formulation. But because humans require culture in order to function, we're faced with a very difficult problem and trade-off, in that we need to be, in any given moment in history, we need to be able to keep a set of conserved, tried, true, and tested solutions for surviving, how to raise our young and how to organize our societies. But we also need to be able to innovate. We need to be able to remain open to novel challenges that arise. It could be because of ecological changes, because of social changes. And it seems as humans, we haven't really figured out where we sit on that. And there's strong individual differences, which I think from a niche construction perspective work quite well. In a society, you need innovators and you need more conservative people. The internet appears to have, and I want to say appears to have ushered us towards the innovation end of that spectrum, perhaps to too far an extent. You very often hear younger people say, well, why should I trust elders? Why should I trust boomers? They don't understand how to navigate the world around us. They don't know how to navigate social media. They don't know the current cultural codes. So there appears to be a lot of novelty. There appears to have been ushered towards an endless road towards innovation. I want to say at the cost of some of the tried, true, and tested solutions for how to run our societies, but that's a separate problem. And the ontological dimensions interest me more than the ethical dimensions. Why I say this is an illusory problem, because necessarily when new innovative ways of being are organically devised, they create a particular kind of social conformity. So conformity is now, of course, no longer bound to spatial boundaries that we can empirically experience ourselves. You can have communities of social conformity that are spread across the planet, but conformity needs to happen in order for people to have shared expectation, a common repertoire, a common values. So we see a lot of this loosening up and tightening up, loosening up and tightening up.
Great. So, Dr. Veissière, let's end on that note then. And just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not that good at self-promotion, actually. Perhaps you could put a link to my website and
Okay, no problem. I will put a link to your website and also a few other links that
they can look up. I used to write for Psychology Today, try to offer cultural, cognitive, evolutionary explanations of what goes on in the world. I haven't written in a few years. I've been taking the time to think, as I ponder my reconversion as a therapist and move much more towards psychoanalysis now. I think at this point, having gone from anthropology to hardcore cognitive science to the clinical world, I find that psychoanalysis for me at this point offers just a fascinating window into a much more fine-grained understanding of the complexities of the human mind.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Ricardo. It was a pleasure as well. Let's stay in touch.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.